So what is mental health? Islam's take on mental health. I'd like to answer this by really kind of looking from within the tradition, and trying to understand mental health in more of a holistic way, more of a psycho-spiritual way, if you will. And Imam al-Ghazali, he says in his Ihya Ulumuddin, in his magnum opus, the revival of the spiritual sciences, of the religious sciences, he says that he starts with a tradition. He says, إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِعَبْدِهِ خَيْرًا بَصَّرَهُ بِعُيُوبِ نَفْسِهِ. That if Allah Ta'ala wants good for a believer, then He will give him or her awareness of his or her deficiencies. And then he starts to talk about this notion of how do you achieve this. So the notion of reformation of self and personal development, right, within the Islamic tradition is a very important one. Right? There's a lot of literature on tahdhib al-akhlaq, tahdhib al-nafs, kind of islah al-nafs, these terms that we utilize. What is all of this surrounding? It's an attempt to consider that the human being, that yourself is very valuable, and that you need to invest in that growth. Why? Because if you don't, there are consequences for them. And Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, who is a 9th century polymath, who wrote a wonderful treatise on the sustenance of the spirit and of the body and the soul, or psyche can be translated as even. And he talks about the need to focus on psychological development. In fact, he takes one of the first that I know of and earliest documented preventative approaches to talk about attitudes and thought processes and communal approaches to being able to prevent illness from occurring, because he says it is inconceivable, almost inconceivable, for an individual to go through life and not experience some degree of distress. Now, he's not necessarily saying it's clinical distress per se. He has actually a whole section on that, on clinical intervention for more dysfunctional problems. But the first half of his book is really devoted to just development of the human being, psychological and spiritual. And by the way, he looks at them as being very much intertwined with one another. And so this is really important for us in the Islamic tradition. Now, going back to Imam al-Ghazali, he also cites another tradition, مَنْ عَرَفَ نَفْسَ عَرَفَ رَبَّهُ. Whomsoever can come to know themselves can know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a saying of many of the Sufis, right? That they even encompass, some people will say this statement is sort of almost a definition of Sufism. The one that can introspect and personally develop themselves, it can come to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'll talk more about just three aspects that the Islamic tradition focuses on when we talk about what is this personal development. One of them is a science that we call al-fiqh al-akbar, or aqidah kalam. This is where you reform your belief system. You actually internalize a belief system about how you understand the world, how you understand yourself, how you understand God, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then you take that understanding into what we call the fiqh al-zahir, external law or jurisprudence, fiqh that we often know of it to be. And that is turning it into some amal, into action, into behaviors. And then there's which is perhaps one of the sciences that has the most convergence with modern psychology, is the fiqh al-batin, is the inner science. And that is what we often know as Sufism or Tasawwuf. And that is your internal characteristics, your ahwal, your states in which you exist in the world. How do you kind of go about doing something? And let me give you just kind of a concrete, let's just kind of take an example. Your belief would be that, there is an afterlife and there's accountability. I believe in a God. I believe that there is an afterlife, and that, suffering in this world will be recompensed in the hereafter. Okay? That I will, Allah says, لَا نُضِيعُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. So that if I do good, I'm going to be rewarded. I know that cognitively, intellectually, right, in my mind. Now, then we turn that into some sort of behavior. Now you're presented with something haram, right? That I should or should not do this. And you either act upon it or you don't act upon it, right? That's your actual behaviors. And sometimes it's tough because our desires are pushing us to want to engage in that action, but our pro-social mind, right, pro-social behaviors or pro-social thinking tells us this is not healthy, it's not acceptable, it's not good spiritually or psychologically even. Then there's the inner part of it. It's how you do it. You do it with ihsan. How do you refuse? What's the inner state in which you approach this action with? What you approach it with a state of shukr, with a state of sabr, with a state of a feeling of itminan, contentment, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching me, and that inshallah there's something better for me than I could even realize. So it's actually your interaction. It's like your real life living inner relationship with the cognitive aspect in real life. So that would be just kind of giving you more of a sort of a concise way of looking at this. Do you want me to pause here? Because I don't know how much time I have. I can add one more layer to this and then sort of take a pause.
You're still good. You can add more.
So the other part I want to add is, well, yes, this is what we want to do, right? As Muslims, right? What am I saying? Introspect, know your own deficiencies and strengths, right? Then what you're going to do is you're going to work on the self, right? Once you sort of diagnose and assess what's going on with you, you're going to want to work on it. What are you going to do? You're going to reform your mind, as I mentioned, your belief system. You're going to reform your behaviors. You're going to reform your internal state. Okay? Now, how? Right? What's the best vehicle of being able to do that? Imam al-Ghazali says, you know what? To gain introspection, there's two main ways, he says. You could be multiple, but he highlights two. He says, one is you do so with a spiritual guide who's trained in this matter, right? Meaning a spiritual guide, like more of the traditional sense. You go to a spiritual lodge, you go to a Sufi sheikh, you go to somebody who's kind of well conversant in being able to deal with these issues. The second one, which I find very interesting, applicable to our conversation and the work that I do, is he says, to the second person is to take a رفيقا عالما بأسرار هذا الأمر رفيقا صالحا عالما بأسرار هذا الأمر, that take a companion, an authoritative companion who's righteous, who is an expert in facilitating change in individuals, and work with that individual to know yourself and then to improve yourself, right? And for them to be able to give you awareness of your own deficiencies, and I'm adding your talents and your proficiencies. And then what you can do is you can translate this into some sort of action. And if we go back to Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, if we go back to Ghazali, we go back to all these people, it's almost a given that personal development is like, necessary. It's a given. Like in Muslim societies, there's different spaces that you need to go to in order to develop yourself. Unfortunately, in a post, industrial kind of world that we live in a very modern world, and now a COVID world electronically, right? We become more and more increasingly isolated, and a lot of things become a bit more industrialized, and we become disconnected, which is actually one of the studies that is found about American Muslims. American Muslims actually have less access to social supports than the average American does in other communities. And so this becomes kind of a paradox, because we want to utilize all the supportive help and aid to develop ourselves and go to these rich spaces, right? Whether it's a lodge, whether it's a masjid, whether it's a madrasa, whether it's communal spaces, whether it's drinking coffee, right? Or tea in the community and being able to interact, and more of a communal social interventions that are also there in historical Muslim societies and still there in some societies today. We are less limited, or we are more limited rather, than those avenues. But this is what we would do to kind of look at, this is sort of a holistic view on mental health.